Hi everybody, it's me, Daniel, although you may know me as 𝐴𝐵𝐢𝐿𝐼𝐺𝐵𝐺𝐠 from the 𝐈𝐧𝐬𝐭𝐴𝐺𝐵𝐺𝐠 or just 𝐴𝐵𝐵𝐢𝐿𝐼𝐺𝐵𝐿𝐼𝐺𝐿 from my own channel. You may have seen my previous video on this channel and Jesse and Geek's video that they did about the maps of all of this stuff. So if you don't know what the heck anyone's talking about, there was a development cartridge for F-Zero X on the N64. And that was found by the Twitter user Forest of Illusion. On that development cartridge is an early build of Zelda 64, which we know now as Ocarina of Time. Now, unfortunately, some of that stuff that was on that cartridge for Zelda was overwritten, so we don't have a complete build. Now, definitely go check out Jesse's video if you're curious about the map differences and things like that. But today I want to talk about the text that was found on the ROM. So there's a lot of text, it's all in Japanese, so I had to stick everything in Google Translate, so I did the best I could, but there's some very interesting things in the text. The first thing I want to discuss, basically the text that displays at the entrance of the dungeon that you'd see when you first enter it. Now, most of these are pretty similar to what you'd expect. We have the Fairy Deku Tree instead of the Great Deku Tree. Sure, minor difference there. Dodongo's Cavern. Instead of Jabu Jabu's Belly, we have Special Course. Not sure what that means. The actual dungeon of inside Jabu Jabu's Belly was still planned at this point. It's still intact here, so we'll get to that soon. So otherwise, we have the Forest Temple, Fire Temple, Water Temple, and then instead of the Spirit Temple, we have what the Desert Colossus is called. The text here confirms that the Desert Colossus was called the statue of the evil goddess Din. Now, as we know from the sort of creation myth, Din was one of the three golden goddesses who created Hyrule and the Triforce. Interesting that they're characterizing Din as evil here. It's never really been implied. Next, we've got some translated text for the different items in the inventory. Now, most of these pretty much exactly the same. You know, you've got your bombs, Deku Nuts. The unused Koopa blue shell design appears to be a landmine of all things, and I find that really interesting. Also, while we're talking about the items, I forgot to mention in the last video, the Lens of Truth. My bad, it looks very different in this version of the game, but it's still the Lens of Truth. Instead of Forest Medallion, we have the Wind Medallion, then Fire and Ice Medallion instead of the Water Medallion, then Spirit, Shadow, and Light Medallion. I should also mention another goof I made in my last video, and which is again confirmed by this text. The bomb bags I accidentally mislabeled as the wallet, but it totally makes sense because of the sizes of them. You got 16, 32, and 64 for the capacity of the bombs. I guess they were going with the 64 theme because it's the same with the quivers for your arrows. And of course, these mystery items that I called them, I couldn't tell what they were at first. I realized after, and thank you to everybody who commented pointing it out as well, those are the wallet sizes, and they're designed more to look like little coin purses. And then there's also labels here for the seals that the sages would give you. I'm not sure what the difference here is between those seals and the medallions, because there is both in the game. But we've got Saria's seal, for Saria being the sage, Darunia's seal, Ruto's seal, Naburu's seal, and instead of Impa, we have Mido's seal. And then of course the Kokiri's emerald is called the Kokiri's jade instead here. We've also got the names of the different song titles. So instead of Minuet of Forest, it's called the Minuet of Wind here. Then instead of the Serenade of Water, it's the Waltz of Water, Gospel of Spirit, and Etude of Shadow. And of course the Prelude of Light, which we'll touch on again later. The pieces of heart here, for some reason, you would have needed to collect 8 instead of 4 pieces of heart. That is bonkers to me. They either had tons of heart pieces around, or you would have a total heart count that was way less than the final game. I'm very glad they cut that down. 8 seems like too many to me. It's pretty well known that Hylia wasn't mentioned as a goddess in the Zelda lore at this point, but there is a spot here called the Cathedral of Hylia. Now, this is not the Temple of Time because the Temple of Time is also here. It seems to imply the goddess Hylia to me because it's a cathedral, but who knows what else it could have meant, because we still have like the name Hylia for Lake Hylia, but not really any other reference to the goddess Hylia. Otherwise, the Waterfall of Wishes is something that was in A Link to the Past. I assume it's the Sleepless Waterfall that we saw in the final game because it's placed in with the Zora's River and Zora's Fountain text here. here. That's just an assumption. It could have meant something else. Waterfall Wishes did appear in A Link to the Past, very close to Zora's domain as well. So it could have a connection there. And instead of the Gerudo Fortress, it's called the Bandits' Hideout here. There's a whole other bunch of text dumped here that seems to be dialogue as well. Now, there was about 96 pages worth of this dialogue when I was translating it, so I'm not going to go through all of it, but I'm just going to point out some of the more interesting stuff. So the first actual piece of dialogue in this dump actually translates to, "It's a secret to everyone." Now that's just kind of a very famous quote from the first game that reappears constantly in the series. Now some of this is not very interesting because there's stuff that's just tutorial if you press the start button, and here's how you use the pause screen. So we're going to skip right over some of that stuff here. Now this is something that was briefly mentioned in my last video as well. There is the horsegrass whistle, which is similar to the horsegrass you actually use in Twilight Princess as well, but we've actually seen early screenshots of the game where you would use this to call Epona instead of Epona's song. So the text reads, "Got a horsegrass whistle, set it to C and try blowing. If you want to ride a horse, try blowing." Here's a little bit more info on the medallions. It definitely confirms that the medallions actually had a purpose in your inventory as usable items. I speculated before that you could use them to combine with the arrows before, which seemed to be implied by the different versions of the arrows on the item subscreen, but it looks like you could have used them just on their own as well. I guess that's not really news because there are early screenshots of the game as well that show those medallions equipped, but still, here's the actual translated text for the different medallions. So it seems the fire medallion would give you some kind of fire magic, which probably ended up being Din's fire in the final game. The ice medallion's a little unclear. It says the fire goes out with a click. It's unclear what that would have done, but maybe fire enemies would have been vulnerable to an ice attack that you use that ice medal for. The wind medal says warp when in danger, so this could have been replaced by Farore's wind in the final game. The soul medal, which I assume is the spirit medallion, lets you become Navi and fly around. Now this is actually a idea that was in Zelda 2. One of the spells in Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, lets you become a fairy and fly around, but it would have been really interesting to be able to do this in 3D in Ocarina of Time. This is also, I guess, sort of an idea that they use later in the Wind Waker when they let you take control of seagulls using the 𝐼𝐬 pairs as well. The light medal says set it to C and illuminate everything, so maybe you could have used it to light up dark areas. It also says the magic of light that captures darkness. The medal of darkness is an interesting one as well. Instead of the shadow medallion, it says if you use it in C, it's straight, it's dark, and the enemy doesn't even notice. So this could turn you maybe invisible or work the same way as the stone mask from Majora's Mask, letting you sort of become unnoticeable from enemies. A lot of the other items are pretty well the same as what we see in the final game, although the iron boots are called the heavy boots in this version. I also thought that based on the design for the hover boots that maybe it was actually the Pegasus boots that we'd seen in A Link to the Past, but the text here still says, "I found hover boots." Sort of mentioned this in my last video, but again, this text confirms it. Instead of having the gauntlets, you would have had the silver and gold bracelets to lift heavier objects. There is the text for when you get the different songs in the game. Instead of saying, "I learned the wind minuet," or the flame bolero, it actually says, "I remembered the wind minuet, the flame bolero," etc. Also, the text for when you meet Epona at the ranch, there was the opportunity to actually name Epona, which was an idea that was brought back in Twilight Princess. In the final version of the game, though, she's just always Epona. And of course, when you meet Malon, she tells you that the name Lon Lon Ranch comes from her and her dad Talon's names. Malon and Talon make Lon Lon Ranch. Here's the dialogue originally from when you first meet Ganondorf after he is chasing Zelda out of the castle. So you would have actually had the chance to reply to him when he asks you which way they went. You'd say they either went straight or turned to the left. Again, Jesse mentioned this in his last video, but when you first see Death Mountain as well, it is introduced to you as Hebra Mountain, also known as Death Mountain. They took the term Hebra out of the final game, and I guess they just held on to that name until Breath of the Wild, when Hebra got its own mountain. Another interesting detail, the Zora village would have been entered, instead of going through the Sleepless Waterfall, you would have to dive down and go to the quote-unquote bottom door. Zora can talk if you approach the door on the bottom of the water. If you would like to visit, please go to the bottom door. Now in the final version of the game, there's a weird alcove at the bottom of Zora's domain, and that alcove, based on this text, I think this was originally the entrance to Zora's domain, that you would come into Zora's domain through here. Either that or you only would have been able to come in through Lake Hylia. Because there's no mention of the Sun Song in this text anywhere, there is instead a different way to pass the time. You could stay at an inn. In fact, there's various inns throughout the game, including one at Zora's domain. Interestingly, Ingo was an innkeeper in this version of the game as well, instead of working at Lon Lon Ranch. Now, there's a line of text here that says, magical medicine, if you drink it, your body will become lighter. If you drink it, your head will come out. I have no idea what the heck that means. Now, there's also this interesting thing. You would have learned the Prelude of Light. Instead of being taught to you by Sheik, you would have learned it by reading it on this stone plate that was carved in front of the Temple of Time. And you would have learned from that how to read ancient sheet music. And one more piece of text that I kind of want to outline here that I think is pretty interesting to note, because there's some other stuff that kind of supports how the structure of the game was changed from here. This would be after you are stuck in the Temple of Light for 7 years, you find yourself back in the Temple of Time, and this text reads, the spiritual stone is stuck, but its brilliance is lost. The door to the sword does not open. So instead of Sheik standing there blocking the pedestal for the Master Sword, here's what I think based on the text in here would have happened. You're sealed in the Sacred Realm for 7 years, just like the final game. Instead of landing by the pedestal of the Master Sword, you're instead outside of that main room in the Temple of Time. The spiritual stones are still there, but they're kind of grayed out, and they've lost their luster, as it were. Then when you go and complete the first 3 adult dungeons, the Forest, Fire, and Water Temple, they would regain their color, and you'd be able to reopen the Door of Time at that point. And then you could have access to travel back and forth through time at your leisure, which you would need to do for the Spirit and Shadow Temple, which both have a child and adult equivalent, or half of those dungeons that you need to do. So this is kind of an interesting structural change through the game here. In some of the unused cutscene files that actually show what these different cutscenes would have looked like here. Anyways, guys, that's kind of all I've got for you right now. I hope you found some of this interesting here. I apologize for the kind of lack of scriptedness for this video, but let me know what you guys think down in the comments below, and stay tuned for more info as it seems to come out. Seems like every day I'm finding more stuff that's interesting from these files here. So thanks so much for tuning in, guys, and have a great day. Bye for now.